Hi, welcome to Physionic, where we learn the body from the macro to the micro. If that's something you think you'd be interested in, then consider subscribing. In today's examined content, we are going to be dissecting this particular paper looking at fructose, and let me make a note here, we are not talking about high fructose corn syrup, we're talking about specifically the molecule fructose versus glucose on diabetes, inflammation, things of that nature in 3 different tissues: in muscle, white adipose tissue or body fat, and as well as the liver. So if that's what you're here to find out about, then let's jump into this examined content. And we're off. Let's get into the experimental methods a bit. So they are looking at 30 different female rats. So this is a rodent study, a rat study. And with those female rats, they separated them into 3 different groups. They had a control group which consumed normal food consumption, had access to the normal rat chow. Then they had the fructose group, which had the normal rat chow or normal rat food, plus a solution of 10% fructose, which they could consume ad libitum, so at will. And then they had a glucose group, which of course was the same as the fructose group, but instead of 10% fructose consumption in the solution that they drank, they had a 10% glucose solution. Makes sense. In terms of the measures that they looked at, they had measures for caloric consumption or food consumption, as well as a variety of anthropometric measures like body weight, girth, things of that nature. They also did glucose tolerance tests, which is a test wherein the mice, or in this particular situation, the rats, were fasted for a period of time where they didn't have anything in their stomach. They had fasting levels of insulin and glucose or blood sugar, and then they inject a set amount of blood sugar or sugar in general, and then they see what happens to that blood sugar once it enters the actual bloodstream. So if it's cleared easily, then that gives them an indication, and if it's not cleared easily, that also gives them an indication. They do the exact same thing with insulin to find out how insulin is working within the bloodstream as well. They also did a little bit of microscopy, so essentially just looking at basic images using a microscope. So it's not going to be overly detailed in that regard, but the bulk of the research, the bulk of the data comes from protein quantification measures, which they take from 3 different tissues. So they're going to be looking at a variety of different insulin signaling as well as inflammatory markers, if that's protein or if that's mRNA. mRNA is the structure that comes before the actual translation of mRNA to protein. So you have gene expression, which then gets transcribed to mRNA, then mRNA is then translated to a fully functioning protein from then on. So they do measures for protein as well as for mRNA, and I'll go into more detail on both of those later on. But they took those measures from white adipose tissue or body fat, as well as muscle, as well as the liver. So with the methods out of the way, let's jump into the results. So I'd like to start off by looking at table 3, which is kind of in the middle of the paper, mainly because that's where you're getting a lot of these measures of caloric content and expenditure and things of that nature, which you don't necessarily get that context in any of the other figures. So this is a good overarching starting point. So table 3 essentially shows that with the food consumption, you see decreases in food consumption with fructose and with glucose groups compared to the control. So they are eating less solid food, but interestingly, they're seeing increases in their liquid intake, which is probably because their liquid intake has, well, the various sugars, fructose or glucose, as opposed to control, which doesn't have anything in their solution. Now, that seems to lead to a greater consumption of caloric content. So the intake of calories seems to be higher in the glucose and fructose conditions because of this overconsumption in the solution, as opposed, even though you see a decrease level of intake in the food consumption area compared to control. And yet, oddly enough, their body weight and their body fat mass was not different between all three conditions, which would then imply that the fructose and glucose conditions, although they didn't actually show this, most likely ended up being more active as a result. They also show that after the 2 months, what were their fasting insulin levels? So without eating for a period of time, then they measure their fasting insulin levels. And we're going to see more figures on this specifically. And interestingly, you see that the fructose group has higher fasting insulin. And if you do the exact same for the glucose, well, interestingly enough, you don't see any differences between the three groups, control, fructose, or glucose groups. So glucose or blood sugar is the same, but fasting insulin levels are higher in the fructose group, and I might even argue that they're higher in the glucose group, but apparently, according to the statistics, that did not pan out. So I'm going to go forward assuming that it's just in the fructose group. And the final point I want to touch on here is that they did measure plasma triglycerides or plasma fat levels or blood fat levels, and they found that they had elevated triglycerides in the fructose group as well as in the glucose group, but certainly a little bit higher in the fructose group compared to control. Now shifting our attention to figure 1, figure 1a shows a difference in the ratio or the proportion of fats. So looking at the different types of fats, you may be familiar with saturated fat and different degrees of unsaturated fat. So if that's monounsaturated or polyunsaturated, well, it seems that in a comparison of just two of the groups, so fructose versus control, you see that fructose has lower levels of polyunsaturated fats and greater levels of monounsaturated fats. Now the story expands from there. So for figure 1c, you see increases in the protein expression, the molecular expression of an enzyme called SCD1, or more aptly named stearoyl-CoA desaturase. And what it does is it literally desaturates saturated fats. So it moves saturated fats and adds a double bond. I'm not going to get into the chemistry now, but it essentially creates unsaturated fats. So it switches saturated fat to monounsaturated fat. So that's most likely where you're seeing this increase in the monounsaturated fats in the fructose condition. And the other figure I wanted to quick touch on was 1D, which looks at CREB, which is carbohydrate binding response element protein, and CREB is a precursor or a molecule that controls lipogenesis, so the creation of new fat from other molecules like glucose, like protein, but specifically in this situation they're looking at glucose or blood sugar or just sugar in general, carbohydrates in general. It doesn't just have to be glucose. And that ends up leading to an increase in this particular molecule in the fructose condition. So that makes some sense. You're getting greater lipogenesis, greater fat synthesis from fructose. Figure 2 is looking at a bunch of molecular measures. So they're looking at insulin receptor substrate 2, which is a particular type or particular isoform of insulin receptor substrate. An insulin receptor substrate essentially propagates or moves forward the inside the cell signaling of insulin. So insulin binds to the outside of the cell, and that leads to a bunch of signals to then tell the cell, okay, insulin has bound, so move a particular transport protein to the cell membrane to allow blood sugar to move from the bloodstream into the actual cell to then use that blood sugar from the bloodstream in the cell for energy generation, ATP. So you want typically more or higher levels of this IRS complex or protein when you have insulin found in the system, because that means that you have greater insulin sensitivity. Now, interestingly here, we show that with the fructose condition, you see decreases in this IRS2. So then what they wanted to measure, and this is, let me just quick touch on this, that this is in liver cells, which is going to be important because different tissues can express differently, although you're going to have trends usually in a particular direction. So then they wanted to measure, okay, let's try and check the other version, the IRS1, which is the exact same thing, but a different variation of it. And what they show is with the fructose group, you don't see a compensatory mechanism. So you don't see increases in IRS1 if you see decreases in IRS2. So this is the first indication right here that there may be something going on, something negative going on with fructose. Now, figure 3 is a really simple figure. It's essentially just taking some really simple microscopy images of the hepatocytes or the liver cells of control versus fructose animals, and they want to see, are there any differences? Are you seeing greater cell death? Are you seeing greater fibrosis in those fructose cells? And it turns out that no, there aren't. So you're not seeing any sort of liver damage that seems to be occurring at least after 8 weeks of fructose consumption. So that's really interesting data right there, because you would think that fructose might have some sort of negative impact on inflammation as well as oxidative stress and things of that nature, which actually really brings us into a nice segue into the next table where they specifically measure exactly those. So here we're looking at table 2, and table 2 is a description or a quantification of a series of different mRNA transcripts, meaning that these are not proteins. They are kind of the precursor to proteins. So the idea is that if you have those mRNAs around, then those will be translated into proteins that will actually function within the actual cell. So they're kind of a rudimentary way of looking at the actual levels of these particular gene expressions. So again, genes are expressed, they are then transcribed into mRNA, which is what we're about to talk about, and then mRNA are then translated to actual proteins. But there are instances in which you can have lower mRNA and also have perfectly normal levels or higher levels of protein. So this isn't a great indication of particular markers. Proteins would be a better marker for what is actually going on. But I digress. Let's jump into what this table actually tells us. And it can be pretty intimidating, but in all reality, we just have to look at a few of the differences between the control versus the fructose. And the table shows that you see decreases in NRF2, which I'm not going to pronounce the entire full name because, well, that can be pretty complex. But NRF2 is responsible for, if it is translated into proteins, it would be responsible for the increase in antioxidant enzymes, so the protection against oxidative stress. And you see decreased levels of this mRNA in the fructose group. So if this were to translate to proteins, and then that would mean that you could potentially see greater oxidative stress because you don't have as many of these proteins around to protect and scavenge against that particular oxidative stress. The other difference was the metallothioneins, which are also decreased in the fructose group, and those also offer a anti-oxidative stress ability. And finally, the last one I wanted to discuss is an actual protein measure. So this is a more reliable measure, and they're looking at ALT, so alanine aminotransferase. And this is actually a really popular clinical outcome, so things that doctors look for to look at liver health. So if they want to find out if your liver is healthy or it's not dying, it's not going through necrosis, which would be the cell death, that is a good indication, because the liver cells have about 3,000 times more of this ALT than other cells. So you can imagine that with liver disease or liver death, you're going to see higher levels in the bloodstream. As these cells explode or start to die off, the contents will spill into the bloodstream, and then you can measure that. So measuring the protein levels gives you a good indication of what's going on in the liver. And what we see is that there's decreases of this particular ALT protein in the fructose condition. So it does not seem to show, and now we've got two different measures that fructose does not seem to negatively impact the liver in terms of inflammation and just liver health in general. Okay, now with figure 4, they're looking at this glucose tolerance test. So they have the rats fasting, and then they inject a set amount of blood sugar, or sugar in general, which ends up in the blood. And then they want to know, is it cleared out quickly, or does it kind of stick around, which would then typically imply that you have glucose intolerance in that situation if it sticks around. And what you find is that the fasting levels, again, and I mentioned this earlier, the fasting levels between all three conditions, and they are including the glucose condition here as well, that is the exact same. And you see this rise in blood sugar levels, as you should, because you're injecting blood sugar into the bloodstream. And it seems to stay elevated longer in the fructose condition, but not the other two conditions, which would imply that you have glucose intolerance. As I mentioned, as the the blood sugar is not being removed by the cells from the bloodstream. Now, figures 4C and D, here you're looking at insulin. So they want to know the exact same thing, but what happens when you measure insulin levels. And at the fasting levels, you can tell just by this injection, or initially right before the injection, that the fasting levels of insulin are already elevated for the fructose group. And again, although statistically it's not the case, I would argue that it's also elevated for the glucose group, but apparently, again, it's not statistically significant, so I'm just going to assume that it's just for the fructose group. So the fructose group has elevated fasting insulin, then they do this injection to check with the whole glucose and whatnot, and you see this concurrent rise in insulin, which makes sense because you need to, the pancreas has to start producing insulin and start putting that out to the bloodstream to connect with all the cells, to tell the cells, okay, through insulin signaling inside the cells, okay, start taking that blood sugar out of the bloodstream. Now, interestingly, however, the return back down to baseline is much slower for both fructose and glucose. So there's some level of insulin insensitivity that may be occurring, especially for the fructose condition. So then they were intrigued by that. So then they start looking at some of these other measures that we're about to go into. Figure 5 is a lot like one of the previous figures, at least the initial part where they're looking at the IRS, so the insulin receptor substrate. And here again, which is completely in line with the earlier one, the only difference is that they're adding glucose condition in this situation, which they didn't add that in last time. So with the addition of the glucose condition, you see the exact same results, that with fructose you see a decrease in this IRS2, and you would typically want higher levels of this IRS2. Then, of course, to make sure that the IRS1 isn't making up for the decrease in IRS2, they check the IRS1 and there's no differences across conditions, which based off of this data then tells us that fructose most likely is leading to some form of insulin insensitivity within the cell. Then they also wanted to measure one of the most popular and most well-researched proteins or molecules named AKT. AKT is also part of that insulin sensitive pathway, and they show no differences between the different groups. So if you were to just measure there, you would think that fructose would not have any sort of impact on insulin sensitivity, but because we know of an upstream molecule that does change, there seems to be an impact regardless. So then they wanted to look downstream of AKT, kind of, it's like a river, just moving from one point of the river to the next part of the river to the next part of the river. And for another protein, FOXO, FOXO is responsible for gluconeogenesis. So that's the creation of new glucose, the creation of more blood sugar by the liver cells to then push that out into the bloodstream. Now, a phosphorylated level of FOXO can't move into the nucleus of the cell and then allow those genes to be expressed to allow for that gluconeogenesis to occur. So if you have higher levels of phospho-FOXO, not just FOXO in general, if you had higher levels of FOXO, you would see increases, presumably, of this gluconeogenesis. But with the phosphorylation, you are blocking that from occurring, and AKT does that phosphorylation. So you're seeing normal levels of AKT, you're seeing elevated levels of phospho-FOXO in the fructose and the glucose conditions, which makes absolute sense, because if you have higher levels of blood sugar, why would you want to pump up your liver to create more glucose and put that into the bloodstream as well? That wouldn't make any physiological sense. So of course it is going to be elevated and inhibited in the fructose and glucose conditions. And then for the final two graphs, they are looking at mRNA, which is again less reliable than looking at proteins, but they wanted a quick look at the mRNA levels of downstream molecules that are also implicated in gluconeogenesis. So like phosphoenol pyruvate carboxykinase, which is a mouthful, but it's always fun to say, that's why I throw it in there. But PepCK is an enzyme that catalyzes the reaction to allow gluconeogenesis to move up, to occur. So you see no differences across conditions. However, interestingly, when you look at another enzyme, a glucose 6-phosphatase, which also is involved in the gluconeogenic pathway, you see decreased levels in just the fructose group. So that's kind of interesting results, but overall, that implies that gluconeogenesis is most likely not happening, which makes sense because, again, you have a glucose-rich environment in the body and in the bloodstream. For figure 6, I just want to quick mention E and F graphs. E is looking at mTOR protein content. mTOR is the master regulator of growth. So in a high energy state, you typically have greater growth signaling. So of course, you're going to see higher levels in the fructose and glucose conditions because you have abundant levels of glucose and abundant levels of energy. So higher levels of mTOR activation. That makes sense. That all falls in line with some of the previous research that we've been looking at. Now, also they looked at TSC2. TSC2 is a protein that will inhibit mTOR if it is not phosphorylated. However, if it is phosphorylated, then it is inhibited and therefore cannot inhibit mTOR. And that's exactly what we find. We see that it is inhibited so that mTOR can function the way that it should in the fructose and glucose groups, but not in the control group. Figure 7 looks pretty intimidating if you're actually looking at the paper. I'm probably not going to put them up in editing, but all the different blots and all the different molecular measures and whatnot, really they're just stratifying. Really, they're just stratifying based off of the 3 different tissue types, the white adipose tissue or body fat, the liver, as well as in muscle, and they're just measuring a single protein, a incredibly important protein that is activated during the insulin process. When you have high amounts of glucose, if you have high insulin sensitivity, something that you want, something positive, then you typically have elevated levels of phospho-AKT. And here we find that with the injection of insulin, of course, you're going to see greater levels in phospho-AKT signaling inside the cells. Because again, insulin is binding to the outside of the cell, leading to a cascade of different molecules that communicate with one another, and AKT is one of those chief molecules. So the phosphorylation of AKT is elevated in the control group as well as in the glucose group with the liver cells. We also see that with the white adipose tissue, so the body fat. But with the most insulin sensitive tissue, we also see elevated phospho-AKT in the fructose group. So we seem to show here that glucose is most likely not leading to insulin insensitivity, and it is leading to insulin sensitivity in the fructose group for 2 of the different tissues, the liver and the white adipose tissue, but not the musculature. Now that could be just because of a function of not having consumed fructose for long enough. If this had lasted for 6 months in these particular rats, then potentially we would start seeing that dampening of that signaling in the muscle condition as well. Figure 8 is a great figure because it goes to my point that I mentioned earlier, that you can measure mRNA expression and you can see some different results of what you would actually find if you measured the end outcome, the protein measures. And here you see a measure of DGAT. DGAT is an enzyme that's involved in the triglyceride synthesis, the synthesis of more fat. And we see that the mRNA expression of DGAT is only elevated in the glucose condition. But from an earlier figure, we also know that you see greater triglyceride synthesis from the fructose condition as well. So here, we don't see that greater expression, or at least statistically significant expression in the mRNA of DGAT, which was something you would necessarily expect. Now, I'll bet if you had measured the protein content of DGAT, it would probably be elevated in both conditions. And then looking at C, again, this is a measure of SCD1, which we looked at in the very first figure, but that was just comparing the protein levels in fructose versus control. Here they're measuring the mRNA levels in the glucose condition as well. And you find that the glucose condition sees increases in SCD1 gene expression, leading to the transcription to mRNA. So you're seeing more of this mRNA. But interestingly enough, you're not seeing that in the fructose condition, although we did measure the actual proteins earlier, and those were elevated in figure 1. So we know that for both conditions now, that SCD1, again, that translation, that conversion of saturated fats to unsaturated is increased in both conditions. Then for D and E, these are markers of inflammation, and you're seeing with the mRNA measures that there's no increase in inflammation. So it seems like, so far, based on a number of different lines of evidence, that inflammation is not elevated in fructose or glucose conditions. But more specifically, we have more evidence for the fructose because they didn't show all the data for the glucose. So for fructose, you're not seeing increases in inflammation. And then for F, they're looking at the fatty acid concentration in the bloodstream. So of course, when you don't add insulin, when you don't have insulin present, you're going to have higher levels of fatty acids. And in all three conditions, you see that because you have less glucose that's entering the cells, so they have to subsist on fatty acids. So your tissue, your white adipose tissue, as well as your liver is going to be creating more or releasing more fatty acids to then feed those cells. But when you add insulin, you are telling those cells that they should start prioritizing the use of glucose, blood sugar. And in that situation, then you don't need as much of these fatty acids found in the bloodstream. So you should see decreases, and you do see decreases. And yet you still see a slight elevation in those fatty acids in the fructose condition, which again, it lends more evidence that fructose leads to some sort of insulin insensitivity. Finally, figure 9, I'm going to quick touch on two of the different graphs. One of them is on AS160, which is another downstream insulin signaling protein molecule, and that has an impact in essentially triggering the movement of this transport protein known as GLUT4 to the cell membrane, which is kind of the last protein. That protein allows the transport of blood sugar from outside of the cell in the bloodstream to inside the cell to then, well, once it's inside the cell, it can be used through glycolysis, the metabolism, to start to create ATP. And here, looking at this measure of AS160, you see phospho-AS160 is elevated in the fructose and glucose conditions. And finally, probably the most interesting or most telling particular part of this figure, and really all the figures, is how much of this GLUT4 transporter is actually around. This is the last protein in the insulin cascade, insulin signaling cascade within the cell. So you see decreases of this GLUT4, which is not what you want. If you have high amounts of glucose in the bloodstream and you want to move that into the cells, you don't want to decrease the number of doorways that it can actually move through. So you see decreases in the fructose condition and you see increases in the glucose condition. So what does that imply? Most likely the glucose is not leading to some sort of insulin insensitivity, but fructose does seem to lead to insulin insensitivity. Finally, some added notes that were in the body of the actual paper that were not represented in figures. There are 2 points. One of them is that the rats consumed 60% of their diet from fructose, which is a massive, massive amount of their diet coming from fructose. Humans typically are in an upper limit of 25% from fructose, and that's extremely high in its own right. So if this necessarily 100%, if the rats were to directly translate to humans, which is a big if as usual, but if it were, they did consume much, much more than a human being would consume. That said, they also mentioned that the liver, there's some evidence that the liver will protect itself by converting kind of intermediate molecules like fructose to fat. So that may be one of the reasons why we saw increases in this fatty acid and triglyceride generation with the fructose condition, and a little bit with the glucose condition as well. But I'm going to touch on that in the very next section so that we can really interpret what's going on here. So let's jump into the conclusions. Okay, in conclusion, here we go. Well, fructose seems to have a detrimental impact on insulin sensitivity, leading to elevated levels of blood sugar levels, as well as leading to a bunch of different molecules within the cell. Some of them are normally expressed, some of them are dampened, however, and you just need one molecule to be dampened to see decreases in insulin sensitivity. And then, of course, the big one was a decrease in GLUT4. So obviously with decreases in GLUT4, you're definitely going to have some level of insulin insensitivity. So that's good evidence, as well as with the glucose. Although you saw some of the similarities between glucose and fructose, the end result ended up with glucose still showing insulin sensitivity. So you didn't have nearly the same level of effect that you did with fructose. So fructose does seem to lead to insulin insensitivity. Glucose, much, much less so, if at all. However, does fructose lead to liver damage or some sort of negative health outcomes for the liver? It does not seem to be the case. So we saw with the microscopy images, and we saw with some of the mRNA, which is definitely lower rung in terms of the actual evidence for something, but it's still evidence that there's not going to be any sort of negative impact on the liver. And yet, I just briefly mentioned this at the end of the results section, that there is some evidence that the liver will protect itself from particular intermediate molecules that may not be favorable. And in those situations, and that's really up to interpretation if it is unfavorable or not, but let's just say that it's just intermediate molecules in general, those intermediate molecules will be converted from whatever they are to fat to protect the liver. That's kind of a theory that's been proposed at this point. And what that could mean is that fructose is being quickly converted to fat, and that could also be the case for glucose, but specifically high levels for fructose. Now, if this were to persist, if they had continued this study for longer than 8 weeks, maybe we would start seeing the liver starting to labor under the burden of having to convert fructose to these different triglycerides, and that's why we see elevated levels of these triglycerides in the bloodstream as well as within the liver. So a lot of different measures here, a lot of really interesting information. In inflammation, it doesn't seem to have much of an impact. Insulin sensitivity, it definitely seems to have an impact. But again, keep in mind that this study was done in rats, so it's not necessarily applicable to humans, but I would venture to say that there's probably going to be some sort of connection. And on top of that, also keep in mind that these rats consume 60% of their diet from fructose, which is way more than the upper limit of what human beings consume. We consume at most around 25% of our diet from fructose, and usually a lot less than that. So if the terror of fructose would be that evident. Maybe not. But keep in mind, again, that if this had continued for the entire lifetime, so if you consume fructose for your entire life, if this were to translate, then that could still have a negative impact on your liver and your white adipose tissue in terms of insulin sensitivity and even potentially your musculature. So a series of different tissues would see decreases in insulin sensitivity and insulin signaling from the consumption of fructose, independent of a gain in body weight, which is really, really interesting here. So that's where I'll leave it. That's, of course, you can check out my notes. You can check out added information in the description box. And with that said, I hope I have the pleasure of speaking with you in the next one. Have a good one, guys. See ya.